At the studio with Kitchen Theory today, we have Simon Alexander Ong, award-winning author of Energize, a book that will open your eyes to the art and science of managing your energy. Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely to be here, Joseph.
So, Simon, we met probably over a year ago now. And when I first heard about your book, Energize, this is because we've been kind of following each other online for a little bit before we actually met.
Yeah.
And I picked up your book and I started reading it. And immediately it kind of, since I was in my teens, I've believed in this idea of energy exchange when you're in any situation in life, right? And I guess a very clear way that I've always explained this to people is, you know how you have certain friends or people that you engage with and you come away with a really kind of high energy and you're like, oh yeah, I feel great. And you have this really great kind of dynamic. And then there are other people that we encounter in life that almost drain you when you're kind of done interacting with them. And I always felt that was some kind of a form of energy exchange, like they're almost sucking my energy away. Or with someone that you have a positive interaction with, you almost, charge each other up. So I've always believed in this kind of idea of energy exchange and putting positive energy into things.
Yeah.
And I guess as a chef, the way this has manifested itself, and I have a good example of this from just yesterday. I made donuts and they were perfect donuts. And you never know with donuts because you've got to let them prove and some will blow up really well and some will just stay all kind of like small and shriveled up. And I was telling the guy who was frying the donuts, I said, do you know why they're puffing up like that? And he said, well, no. And I said, it's because I gave them loads of good energy as I was making them. I speak to the donuts in the same way that people speak to plants, right? And I do think that has an effect on living things. Am I completely mad or am I on the right track?
You are on the right track. I mean, I think Maya Angelou said it best, Joseph, when she said that people will forget what you did, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget the way you made them feel. And every interaction we have with another human is an exchange of energy. We're here in your studio. If you think about cooking, when you go home and visit your family or loved one after a while, and they've put together a plate of food that has love put into it. People often say there's nothing quite like mum's cooking or my grandma's cooking. Yeah. It's because the energy they put into that plate of food is very different to when you go to somewhere and the person that put it together just because they had to. You can feel that energy through a plate of food. Now, if we can feel that through people, if we can feel that through food, it must be true that we can feel that through every interaction we have with something else. There's a transference that is going on every single time.
And I remember years ago, I was reading a book called Molecular Gastronomy, and it was by a gentleman called Hervé Tisse, who's a French chemist and is like the godfather of molecular gastronomy, which is kind of a modern style of cooking, or a more scientific perspective on cooking. And in an article that he had written, he talked about this idea of being able to measure the amount of love that one puts into cooking. So he works, for context, with a chef called Pierre Gagnère. And together they've kind of explored this area of modern cooking. But for a scientist to talk about the fact that love is in some way that maybe X factor that gives food something special. How is it that energy is doing that? Why does that affect us in that way?
Sure. Well, if you think about love, the opposite of love is fear. And when we look at energy is all about vibration. And love is the highest form of vibration that there is. If you look back to a point in your life where maybe you had a crush on someone, or there was something you really wanted to do no matter what, that connection to that thing is love. Love can make us do things that are on the outside quite irrational. I remember when I was dating my first girlfriend and I had a packed schedule for the evening. And she said to me, actually, I'm free tonight. Would you be able to catch up this evening? And even though I had a packed schedule, I found time. I found time, right? So we end up doing irrational things when love takes over. And this is why love is the highest level of energy, because it brings something out of us. It transforms us in some way. We seek love, whether it's self-love, love with someone else, and that's what makes us feel whole. Whereas fear is on the other side because it can create very negative consequences.
So, just for people who haven't read your book yet, when you talk about energy, we're not just talking about, a kick of caffeine. How do you approach this idea of energy and energy management?
Sure. So on the one hand, energy is the way you show up. We touched on it just now. It's the feeling people get when they interact with you. That's energy on one side. On the other, it's influenced through 4 dimensions. So it's physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And it all begins with physical energy. Simply put, unless you stop making your health a side hustle, you won't have the energy to do much else. To the healthy person, they will have lots of hopes, dreams, and goals. But to the sick, they have only one: to be better, to be well again.
Yeah.
So physical energy is comprised of sleep, nutrition, and movement. Now, if you are getting sufficient rest, if you are moving your body on a regular basis, and you're feeding it well, you have a great baseline of energy to work from. You mentioned the word caffeine just now. I often tell my clients that the best caffeine is 8 hours of sleep. When you've had a good solid 8 hours of sleep, you start the day with the energy to tackle whatever challenges you may face.
Well, you mentioned those 3 very important points here. And actually in part 1 of the book, under Awaken Your Power, you talk about this idea of investing in your health.
Yeah.
And you list sleep, exercise, and diet. And I think that was the kickoff point for when I read that I thought, oh, we've got to have a conversation. And the reason for that is it was really the way you put it in terms of investing in your health. Now, I'm of this school of thought that for some people, because a lot of people now like to go around and sell products and sell the idea of, food as medicine.
Sure.
And if I'm honest with you, I don't agree with that at all. I do not think I think anyone who says food is medicine hasn't been really sick and needed powerful medicine, because medicine it's done miracles for us in the last, 50 to 100 years. But a healthy and balanced diet is the best life insurance, or the best insurance you can have against getting ill in the first place and requiring medication. And so when you talk about investing in your health, I do think that this idea of it being able to think about diet as something that you're investing in.
Yeah.
How have you found that kind of people approach this idea of finding balance in these areas of how they manage their lifestyle around sleep, exercise, and diet? What are the things that people can do to find better balance in those areas?
Well, first of all, the biggest obstacle we face when thinking about sleep, diet, and movement is we're busy. We're in a world where people are experiencing greater symptoms of burnout. They are overloading their calendars. And when you live a busy life, moving from meeting to meeting and going through the same routine every single day, it's very difficult to find time to rest, time to address your diet, and for exercise. And so often the first place to begin is to ask yourself, what can I simplify or eliminate from my schedule so I have time for my health? So I can start sleeping on a regular timetable, so I can meal plan ahead of time, and I can integrate movement into my daily life. That's often the first place. If you're so busy, adding more isn't going to help you. It's going to overwhelm you. So the first place is to look at your schedule and start simplifying. Start eliminating things that aren't really aligned to where and who you want to be.
So really it's about being aware of one's priorities, right, as well.
Yeah.
And what you're saying as well is you need to shift up the priorities of sleep, exercise, and diet.
Yeah.
And maybe people would say, well, I'm too busy. But if you prioritize those things, then that makes it easier, then you're saying, to find the time.
Yeah. And the priority is a big word here, because when people tell me they don't have time, what they're really saying is that this is not a priority for me right now. Because we all have the same time in a day. We all have 24 hours. And it's up to you as to how you use those blocks of time. When somebody says to me, I don't have time, I say to them, well, when was the last time someone recommended a TV show to you? And often we can think of when that comes to mind. And even if you've got a busy week or weekend ahead, you find time to watch that show because someone recommended to you, you get curious, and now you found the time. And the reason is because that became a priority for you. It became a priority to check it out and then get sucked into the series or to see the next episode. So you've got to make health a priority first before you can start dedicating time to it. And actually realize in the grand scheme of things that you have the time you need. Just 1 hour a day dedicated to movement or planning your meal for the day ahead is less than 5% of your day. I mean, if you can't dedicate time to that.
And what have you found from experience that, because I guess there's an element of it where when someone gets ill, all of a sudden they're going to prioritize their health, right? That puts it in the spotlight all of a sudden, and then we rearrange our priorities to kind of focus on that in some way. How can people do that if they, like, you don't want that as your motivation? How do you get yourself out of your current cycle and into, is it a shift in mindset? Is it a change in lifestyle patterns? Is it all of the above? How does one go about that?
I think the first place to start is not to seek motivation, because motivation is what I call a push force. It means that if you're relying on an external push, so that external push could be watching a motivational video on YouTube. It could be going to a seminar, reading a book. If you're relying on these external pushes, you're going to need them again and again and again and again. What's better is to find something that creates a magnetic pull. So a pull is different to a push. A push, you feel like you have to keep forcing yourself to do something you don't really want to do. Whereas a pull is where you wake up in the morning to the smell of possibilities. You don't know why you're waking up, but there's just this energy that pulls you out of bed in the morning, drawing you to somewhere. And in order to create that, you have to have clarity of vision. What is it you are working towards in the long term? What is that future you look like when he or she is exactly where they want to be? And then you work backwards. And you work backwards by time traveling from that future you to the present you and acting from that place. And when you act from that place, it's not difficult to make a choice because the choice is already made. If your future self is somebody who is athletic, who is living a long and healthy life, and you travel back to the you today, guess what? When you go to the supermarket, you don't have to decide which aisle to push your trolley into. You know immediately what you want to put into your trolley because it's coming from that place of identity. So I think it's about understanding that future self, because once you do, it creates this magnetic pull that gets you out of bed in the morning.
Well, because in the context, I think where I'm really looking at this is in the context of diet.
Yeah.
Because I guess over the last 50 years, we can see globally that there's a huge growing issue around people's relationship with food. And as a result of this, we have poor metabolic health, increases in illnesses like diabetes, and the levels of obesity now are not only high in adults, but where it's most concerning is the growth in obesity in children. And now you even have the term super obesity that is being used for children and young adults. At Kitchen Theory, we're particularly interested in kind of looking at how the sensory and psychological relationship that people have with food, how this in some way can potentially impact and encourage people, nudge them towards having a more positive relationship with food, encouraging them to eat more nutritiously, more sustainably. And I feel a lot of what you're just talking about there is also very important, because it's not just about the environment you're in. It's not just about the foods that you have on offer, but it is very much about the mindset that you have. So what is it that people who are struggling with their relationship with food, what is it that they can do on an energy level to help them with overcoming the psychological and habits, the poor food habits that they have?
Two things come to mind, Joseph. First is experience. If something is fun and enjoyable, you are more likely want to do it again. You know, if I look at habits, for example, at a broad level, if I have to do a process in order to achieve a goal, but the process feels like a chore, I'm not going to feel energized to do it. It's going to require me to really motivate myself to follow through on the process. But if I ask myself a question such as, what would this process or habit look like if it were more fun? And I change my relationship with it, so suddenly it feels like I'm in a game, then what happens is the way I show up to do that process will be very different. And I think the same can be applied to food. If your relationship to, for example, vegetables isn't the best because you see vegetables as something that isn't really tasty or delicious, well, how about if you change up the way you prepare your vegetables? If you were to change the experience of eating vegetables to something that is delicious and fun and presented in a way that makes you want to eat it, then what happens is you're more likely to do that activity. And the second thing that comes to mind is environment. You know, we all have this lazy part of our brain that when emotions take over, we make rash decisions. So even if you are the healthiest person you know, you've had a long day, and let's say you've skipped lunch because it was such a busy day, you go home and you're faced with two options. Now, when you open your cupboard, there's some takeaway food from the night before, which you can eat immediately, or there's some fresh food that you can prepare, but it's going to take you around an hour to prepare that food. Now, what happens is when emotion takes over because you're hungry, you're going to go straight for the easy option, which is the junk food, because your body's saying, feed me now. Now, what we can do knowing that ahead of time is we can set up an environment around us that makes it impossible not to succeed in what we want to do. So instead of having that junk food as an option at home, replace it with healthier options. Fruit bowls, nuts, things that are actually going to be good for your body. So my wife and I have consciously done this at home. And so when our 4-year-old daughter is coming back from school and she's running around the home and she's saying to us, I'm really hungry, and she's looking through the cupboards, what she comes out with is some bananas, some fruits, some seaweed, some nuts, things that are actually going to be healthy for her body.
And that will satiate that kind of that craving that you have in that moment where, as you said, you'll make those kind of irrational decisions because you're driven by hunger, mood, and kind of emotion. You mentioned in the book, and this also really grabbed my attention. I can't even find my nose on it, but I remember it, which was upgrade your fuel. Is that the phrase that you use?
Yeah. We have to upgrade our fuel.
And what do you mean by upgrading our fuel?
So I think the person that comes to mind when I think of the phrase upgrade your fuel is a story in the book I share about Arsene Wenger. So Arsene Wenger was the former manager of Arsenal Football Club, and he came from Japan. He was managing a club in Japan called Grampus Nagoya. And when he came to Arsenal Football Club, he was shocked at the fuel they were feeding their body. In fact, in one interview, he said to the people in the room, when I was in Japan, the average diet was soup, boiled vegetables, radishes, rice, and some protein, meat or fish. He came to London, and when he looked at the canteen of Arsenal Football Club, he said, I was just aghast. There was full of puddings like sticky toffee pudding and apple crumble, and just things I didn't feel would give them the energy they needed to play in that field. And I simply said to the football players when I gathered them together in the canteen, if you're always going to be eating sticky toffee pudding, when you go out on that field, you're going to play like one. That's the fuel you're feeding yourself with. Yeah. You become what you feed yourself. And so he sought to change the nutritional plan for all of his players. He changed up the food on offer in the canteen. And within a couple of years, they had achieved what no other team before them had done, which was to go for an entire Premier League season, not losing a single match. And when some of their rivals were interviewed in the years after that experience, they said things such as, that Arsenal team was the leanest, the fittest, and most energetic team we had ever played against. They just had this zest on the field that made them unstoppable. And that's what earned them the title, the Invincibles.
And this idea of what we put into our bodies is becoming even more interesting in a sense in terms of the science behind this now, because over the last 10 years, we've started to understand so much more about gut health and that mind-gut connection. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the nutrients that we absorb from our food are not only having an impact on our weight, because a lot of people think about health in the context of weight and their ideal weight.
Yeah.
We don't really think beyond that in terms of our gut health and our microbiome, and thinking about, you know, the amount of fiber that we take in, and the amount of nutrients, like, let's say, you know, something like tryptophan that you get from eating things like turkey.
Yeah.
That converts into your body into the chemicals that essentially will release as serotonin in the brain, which is obviously the kind of happy brain chemical. And so what we are consuming is quite literally being converted into chemicals in our body, and many of these chemicals can in some way alter or regulate our moods. This idea of mood foods has then subsequently become kind of more of interest in the last, let's say, 5-10 years. I get asked a lot about this idea of kind of, you know, mood foods, and I would say that contrary to what the popular demand is, we all want to be able to just eat a bar of something, or drink you know, a concoction of some kind that's going to boost our energy or elevate our mood. And again, like with the medicine thing, I don't quite think that food is there to play that role, to serve that role in terms of, you know, I think caffeine does a great job of giving you an instant perk. And I think there are other stimulants that obviously affect your mood, alcohol being a very obvious one, maybe not a positive one, but definitely a clear way of seeing how your mental state and physical state is affected by something that you consume. But I think, again, it's about taking that longer term mindset that you were talking about, in terms of having that vision or goal, and then kind of trying to curate your, as you said, your environment around that to make that achievable in some way. From your experience with clients that you've worked with, what are successful tactics that one can use to change their mindset, to develop that vision? What if I don't have that vision quite clearly there in front of me, and I want to be this healthy, fit person who's eating a well-balanced diet? What are the tools that one needs to move into that space?
So this is for me where the coaching begins, because as you said, each of us will have a different definition of what success looks like. We will also have a different definition of what a healthy lifestyle looks like, simply because we're going to have different constraints, different obligations, and different career, which means some of us might be working through the night, some of us might be working hours we're not in control of. And so the first thing I would ask someone is, what does a healthy lifestyle look like to you? Because everyone's going to be at a different point in their journey. And then it's to go deeper and to understand somebody's reasoning. So what does a healthy lifestyle look like to you? And then what must happen for that to be a normality? What must happen for this to be part of your everyday? And then the next part down is, what is important about leading a healthy lifestyle to you? And for me, this is where we can get quite personal.
And that's where you get your why.
Yeah,
right?
This is where you start to get to your reasons and your why. Because for someone, it could be, I want to live a long life so I can see my grandchildren. It could be something as simple as that. But once you get to that knowing of the impact a positive, healthy lifestyle could have for you, that's when you begin to tap into that vision. You start to see what it would be like if you could have a long lifespan that's not just long in terms of length, but also healthy. There's no point living long if you're going to be living long in sickness, right? You want to live a long and happy life. And so once we've got clarity on that, it just creates a bit of inspiration from within to then look at what we can do today to increase the probability that that will happen. Now, nobody's guaranteeing you're going to get there and it's going to happen overnight, but all we can do is stack the odds in our favor, increase the probability that this can be something we can enjoy.
And I guess a big part of this, as you said, is kind of identifying your why, starting to build an environment around you that, you know, supports this.
Yeah.
And then I guess it comes down to some degree, that when you're in the moment, that mindfulness about what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
about how you're spending your time. And I think mindfulness, I'm fascinated by, I'm fascinated by all types of meditation. And I've been meditating since I was a teen in different kind of ways, or exploring different methods of meditation. And when I read Energize, it kind of again reaffirmed this idea of how important, mindfulness is in our approach, and being mindful of our lifestyle, our diet, our energy. What would you say is how do people become more mindful of their energy management? Because I think we're aware of energy, but how do you actually manage it on a daily basis? What does that mean in a very practical sense?
Sure. So at a high level, when it comes to awareness, it's important to understand you cannot have self-development without self-awareness. You can't change what you're not aware of. Awareness is the beginning of change. And when we look at it from the point of view of managing your energy, it's about just asking yourself at different points in the day, how do I feel right now?
So checking in with yourself.
Checking in with yourself. On a scale of 0 to 10, how do I feel right now in terms of my energy? And then start to question that feeling. So if you've just given yourself a 4 out of 10 in terms of how you feel right now, what is driving that 4? Why not 5? Why not 3? What was it that made you choose 4? And then you get to understand the drivers that are influencing your thinking and your feelings.
And we're not just talking about physical energy in terms of feeling a bit lethargic.
No.
You're talking beyond that, right?
Beyond that. So remember at the beginning, I spoke about 4 dimensions. So we've
Yeah.
got physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual.
Yeah.
So to give an example, if I touch on the spiritual, if you look at society around us, in many cases, they're exhausted, not because they're physically doing too much, but number one, they're doing too little of the things that bring them joy. And second, they're running someone else's race. So you might be exercising, sleeping, and eating well, but if you're not doing the work that brings you joy or allows you to express your talents, what's going to happen is that you're going to begin every week looking forward to the final 2 days of the week, i.e. the weekend. And then that's no life to live. Why live a life where for 5 out of every 7 days, you're looking forward to weekends and holidays? And there is this mind-body connection. But when we think about energy management, because if you know mentally that you are a square peg in a round hole and you don't fit the work you're doing at the moment, what happens is that Sunday night and Monday morning, those thoughts create physical tension in your stomach. So you wake up with this anxiety inside. That's the mind-body connection happening. And so if that is the case, if our mind and our thoughts can make us ill, can it not make us better? And so this is understanding that we live in the feeling of our thinking moment to moment to moment. If we're aware of what's driving and influencing our energy, both in a positive and negative way, then it's up to us to change our focus away from the things that are draining us of energy and focus it on the things that are actually giving us energy.
So I'm really interested in this because this kind of goes into territory that I remember when I first discovered Joe Dispenza, Dr. Joe Dispenza.
Dr. Joe Dispenza, yeah.
And he talks a lot about this idea of, healing
Yeah.
sickness. And I'm not just talking about kind of mental illnesses, but even physical ailments that people have through going very deep inside oneself.
Yeah.
Just you obviously will know a lot more about this than me, but how can our energy, because we know, okay, food, we know that it can, heal us in the long run or in the long term, and especially having a healthy diet. But how can managing our energy and how can positive energy and negative energy actually impact on our physical well-being and health?
Well, going back to what I said just now about the way we live in the feeling of our thinking moment to moment. Now, the reason this is powerful is because whatever you bring into your mind as a thought, it influences the action you take or don't take. So if we look at an event that you've experienced at some point in your life, you may interpret that event to be negative. But here's the truth. The event is neither negative or positive. The event just is. But we as humans, we have to make meaning from what happened to interpret as either good or bad. Now, if you interpret it as bad, you're going to take an action driven by that thought. But if you choose to see that event as good, you're going to take a very different action. So what this tells us is that we don't live in one common reality. We live in customized realities that are driven by our thinking. Once you know this, you then have the understanding that at any moment you can choose one thought over another. And this is literally how you can create changes from your mind that impacts the rest of your biology. So there's a word that I share in a book called pronoia. So paranoia is this belief and feeling that the world is trying to sabotage me in some way.
Yeah.
So I know you could be in a company working towards a promotion.
Yeah.
But you have this feeling that there are people around you trying to sabotage your likelihood for being promoted.
That life is in some way conspiring against
Exactly.
you.
The life is conspiring against you, and you enter this victim mentality. Why me? Why didn't I get that? Why is he or she progressing faster than I am? Why couldn't I get that recognition?
Versus pronoia,
which is the opposite. And it's the belief that the universe is conspiring in my favor and that life is working for me and not against me.
See, now, I think I have a heavy dose of pronoia. I do feel that life conspires. And doesn't mean that my life has been smooth or easy, but I do take even the bad things and kind of think, well, what have I taken out of this? And, you know, hindsight's 2020, right? And you look back and you kind of think, oh, well, if that awful thing hadn't have happened then, I wouldn't be here now doing this.
And this is why I encourage people to see life through the lens of pronoia. Now, the thing to understand is I'm not saying one approach is right or wrong. All I challenge people to do is to give it a go. For 1 month, try viewing your life through the lens of pronoia. So everything that happens in your day-to-day life is happening for you and not against you. And just notice what happens. Because when you look at life through the lens of pronoia, it's actually more productive because you're focused on what you can do, not on worrying about the things you can't control. So if you go through an unexpected event, paranoia would say, why me? Why did this have to happen again? Pronoia would say, what is the lesson here? What is this trying to teach me? It's helping you to focus your mind on action, something that you can do that is empowering. Because that's how you move forward. That's how you make progress. But it also influences our biology. You know, this is where in the field of medicine, you have this term called the placebo effect. That if you believe something to be true so powerfully, it literally happens. It literally has the desired effect. And even more if it feels like it's credible. So if, let's say I was to walk on the street in my black t-shirt and jeans and I gave a tablet to someone in the public, they probably wouldn't believe that would have any impact on them. But if I dressed up in a lab coat, I walked into hospital, I pretended to be an award-winning surgeon, and I say, we've been working on this for 3 years and it's already had incredible impact, and I recommend you give this a trial to see its impact on you as well. They're more likely to believe that's going to work because you've got the added credibility of me in a white lab coat in a hospital with a credential behind me. So if you add credibility into belief, it can be transforming.
Part of what you're saying there really takes me back to this kind of some of the thoughts of the Greek Stoic philosophers, in the sense of, I think it was Marcus Aurelius who said something along the lines of, it's not a situation that can hurt you, it's how you interpret the situation. So I'm not hurt by this situation or this action unless I choose to be hurt by this kind of situation. And I think a big part of it is how we internalize and how we interpret these different situations that we get thrown into in life. And as you said, then that kind of that initial reaction then lays out the actions that we take, I guess, in response to it. Now, how does one develop that mindset, though? How does one almost step back from a situation that they're put into? And I mean, I remember when reading quite a bit about NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, this idea of reframing being a kind of interesting tool maybe to use in terms of taking a situation but then kind of reframing it and I guess that comes with the pronoia thing, right? Which is you're taking a situation, you're trying to kind of reframe it in terms of, well, how does this work? And
the reframing begins with the questions you ask yourself. Because whenever you go through an experience, you're going to have this element of self-talk. So there'll be a person inside of you that will criticize you or be very harsh about what happened. Why did you do that? Why couldn't you have done this differently? But first of all, if you're more compassionate to yourself and you ask yourself better questions, what happens is you actually get better answers and you respond in a better way. So, for example, what else could this mean? A question as simple as that. What else could this mean? Now, what that teaches you is that there is always another perspective than the one you may be thinking at that moment. And there's this great parable, I don't know if you've come across it before, by the old Chinese farmer who had worked his crops for many years.
Yes.
And one morning his horse escaped from the village, and the neighbors came together and they said to the farmer, "What bad luck that you've lost your prized horse." And the farmer calmly responded without reacting, just saying, maybe, maybe not. The next day, not only did the horse return, but it brought with it some wild horses. And the neighbors again said, "What great luck, what turn of fortune that all your horses returned. Not only did you get the prize horse, but you got some new ones to add to your stable." The next day, the farmer's son tending to one of these wild horses broke his leg in the process. Neighbors offered their voice by saying again, "What bad luck that he broke his leg." Farmer again responded, "Maybe, maybe not." And on the final day, with the army moving through the village, recruiting all able-bodied men to fight in the Great War, they recruited everyone apart from the farmer's son, who had broken his leg. And the neighbors rejoiced. And they said, "What turn of fortune that your son is spared from fighting in the war?" And the farmer said, "Maybe, maybe not." Now, when we look at society, a lot of us respond in the same way as those neighbors.
Yeah.
We're quick to judge, we're quick to react, and we see it in sometimes a negative way. But if we were to react in the same way as the farmer, to take a step back, to be calm about our response, and to notice that there sometimes can be a better perspective to take than falling into the trap of judging it too quickly.
And that's fascinating. I think I read that story and it left quite an impact. I remembered it because there's an element of kind of stepping back from any given situation. And like the farmer, rather than jumping to the conclusion that something good is actually good for you in the long term, I guess it's about finding that balance, right? And not letting the lows get too low and the highs get too high. And I think that's something I would say in my own entrepreneurial journey, I've kind of been forced into learning that, or at least adopted that, because you realize that, you know, in order to be able to manage a business over a decade and more now, at some point, you have to find that kind of medium balance and not let the lows get too low and not get too kind of swept away with the high points as well.
Absolutely. It reminds me of this Zen saying that goes, "Be attached to no outcome and open to everything at the same time." Now, if we dissect that sentence into two parts, the first part, be attached to no outcome. What this is trying to explain is that so many of us are caught up in giving up our emotional well-being to something that may or may not happen. So when I think about outcomes that we attach our happiness to, it could be things such as when I get that promotion, when I make those $1 million, when this happens, then I can do something. Now, what happens in reality is that in the present moment, you're not actually living in it. Because you're frustrated or you're anxious or you're always looking at the future, waiting for that outcome to happen. So you end up going through life in this tragic scenario of living as if you are never going to die and then dying having never really lived. The second part of that sentence, which is and open to everything, that means that you're living in the present and you're open to the fact that whatever you would like to work towards may manifest in very different ways. You know, if I look at my journey from exiting employment to becoming an entrepreneur. When I first started, I said to myself, well, hey, the outcome I'm looking for is to build a thriving one-to-one coaching practice. If I can do that, I'll be a happy man. But I wasn't wedded to it. It was something I was working towards, but I wasn't overly attached to it. And it was good that that wasn't the case, because as time went on, I then added speaker, author, consultant, investor, co-founder to the things that I did. And so I was open to everything. And this is part of how you want to approach life. It's accessing that creative energy of being open to what may come your way and not being too rigid to an outcome without understanding that actually you may get something better than the outcome, or it could arrive to you in a very different way than you could have imagined.
And I think that's interesting because as well, I believe having that open-mindedness allows you as well to be more creative.
Yeah.
And I guess in my field of work, but I think for a lot of people, creativity is something that we prize, that we value, that we, that is, well, creativity even allows you to look at situations, that whole idea of reframing, if you're kind of, if you've got that creative energy, being able to look at scenarios and situations that you're in from a different perspective. I think it even carries through into that. I'm not just talking about creative in terms of, designing a cool creative new dish or a creative advertisement or whatever it may be, but it's creativity kind of in one's life that we have. And you mentioned something kind of around this in terms of, that creativity, that almost like childlike enthusiasm and creativity that we almost seems to kind of peters out as we get older and older. How does one retain that? How does managing our energy help with that, creative energy?
Children are naturally creative. I just have to look at my 4-year-old daughter. I remember recently she was going to a class, and at the end of it, they gathered the girls in a circle, and the teacher said to all of them sitting there, I've got a box of toy eggs. Each of them are different colors, and when you move it, it shakes and makes a sound. Now, as a thank you for coming and as a reward for your contribution, you can each take one. So she goes around the circle, each girl takes one. And then it arrives at my daughter at the end of the circle. Her name is Sienna. And so the teacher says to Sienna, you can only take one. And Sienna takes two. And the teacher stops and says, Sienna, you're only meant to take one. So then Sienna smiles and she looks at the teacher and she says, but I did only take one. The other one is for my dad. And so she got away with it. And so she gave me the egg. And when we walked out of the classroom on the way back home, she looks up at me and says, Dad, can I have my egg now?
Yeah.
So she was able to get 2 eggs despite the constraint that she was only allowed to take 1. And so that was her creativity in action. And I think, as you said, as we grow older, we tend to lose that sense of play, that sense of fun, that ability to access that creative energy that we all have deep inside of us. And one of the ways that we can keep that energy is to ensure that we have diverse inputs into our thinking. Because if you're always reading, watching and listening to the same things over and over again, or if you're in business, if you're only ever looking at your competitors, then guess what? You're going to think like everyone else is thinking, or you're going to only rise to the level of your competitors. But if you look outside of your industry, if you bring in different influences into your thinking, that's when you start to think in a very creative and original way. I don't know if you know this, Joseph, but when Steve Jobs went to Japan, on one of his trips, he loved Japan because he was big into Buddhism. He noticed that there was this electrical appliance company that produced rice cookers. And so people that had these rice cookers in their home, they would connect it to the power supply with a magnetic cord. And when Steve Jobs saw that, he said, this is beautiful design. Why did you go about creating a magnetic cord? And the company told him that it was because if a child was to run around the home, trip on the wire would fly off, but the appliance, which was quite heavy, would stay still. And so Steve Jobs said, we've got to bring this into our next MacBook Pro. So he flew back to California, he met with the design team, and he said, now we have to have a magnetic cord in our future laptops. And when it was released, the media held that move as truly innovative. This is a genius idea. And yet it came about from looking outside of his industry. So we can all access it. It's just understanding how can we create diverse inputs into our thinking so we can start to unleash that creative energy.
I'm all about cross-disciplinary collaborations. No, really, I think I completely agree with you. And it was meeting Professor Charles Spence at Oxford University over 12 years ago now that really sparked that in terms of, I went along to one of his talks, and here was a Oxford University psychologist talking about food, but in a context that I had never really thought about it in terms of this kind of experiential realm, the psychology and sensory relationship that people have with food. And ever since then, I've made it a big part of I guess the approach that we have at Kitchen Theory is to work with people from different disciplines, because if we truly want to be doing something that's different from every other chef and restaurant and food hospitality provider, we're not going to do that by looking at what everyone else in the industry is doing. The only way we're going to truly find inspiration to create new and interesting concepts and ideas is by working with people from different backgrounds. And so Professor Spence, being a psychologist, was one of the first kind of forays into that. Since then, we've worked with everything from astrophysicists like Dr. Roberto Trotta at Imperial College. We've worked with surgeons like Professor Roger Kneebone, again at Imperial. We've worked with Dr. Kirill Veselkov, who runs the Dream Lab at Imperial. We've worked with, at the time, he was the head of the Magic Lab at Goldsmiths, Gustav Kuhn, who I actually recorded a session with as well. And he studies the psychology of magic, not magic, but the psychology behind magic. And it's through those rich kind of interactions and conversations with people like that you start to take inspiration that drives the creativity for what a dish could be, and the narrative, the story, in some cases the technique or whatever it may be. And I think in a way we found a similar kind of driver in the project that we're working on at the moment. And I'm sure by the time this is online, we will have probably already launched the first of our Energize dinners. But maybe it's worth kind of talking people through a little bit about why we wanted to work together on this. And I think from Kitchen Theory, from our perspective, when I read the Energize book, I just thought this would be really interesting, because all the lessons that are in there, I think everyone can relate to. And I love universality in things. And I think food is one of those, sitting at a dining table is a universal thing that most people can enjoy, or most people do enjoy. Some cultures have it more than others. But at the same time, I think all of us enjoy, we celebrate around food. You know, food is one of the basic needs that we as human beings have, that we actually really take pleasure in. I don't think many people, and some people do, but rarely will you ask, you know, a girl out on a date to go take a breath of fresh air. Be a cheap date. Rarely do you do that. You know, again, you know, drinking water as a basic need, sleep is a basic need. But these aren't things, again, that we really tend to associate with pleasure and enjoyment, even though people get lots of pleasure out of sleeping, but it's not really an activity that you take part in to celebrate.
And I think it goes back to this idea of food, the eating of food is an experience.
Yes.
And when we look back on our life, we recall more the things that we've experienced. And so if you've gone on a date with someone to a nice restaurant, you're not just going to recall the date, you're also going to recall the experience in your visual part of your memory. And so it makes it very easy for us to revisit those moments.
And so it really made sense to me that we would find a way of working together on bringing Energize and its lessons and stories to life as part of one of our dining experiences. And I guess, what was it? That's what attracted me from our side to kind of, you know, think, okay, well, I think this really works. What is it from your side that you would say, kind of, as the author of this book, why did you think that having a dining experience would be a good idea?
Well, first of all, when it comes to creativity, I love expressing my creativity by doing things that are different, by doing things that haven't been done before. And I believe when we first met, and then when we, as you said, we exchanged messages on social media first. When we first met, I felt the energy from you as well, that you were somebody who was highly creative, that wanted to do things different, to design experiences that people would remember for a very long time. And that was very much my ethos as well. So you spoke about some of those collaborations. You know, when I was launching the book, I did partnerships with a bartender, a metaverse game designer, where we created this world in the metaverse that people could jump into. And it was my avatar doing a book launch in the metaverse. I collaborated with an artist where she designed a painting based on Energize and other projects like that. And so when we came together, I realized that I haven't actually done food yet when it comes to my book. And it just sparked these ideas in my head as to what that would look like if we came together to do something.
Tell me a little bit more, because I know the project you're talking about, but I want to give a shout out to Agostino. So the cocktail bartending project that you worked on, tell me a bit about that.
Sure. So I've known Agostino Peroni for a number of years now.
And Agostino Peroni, for everyone who is watching, who doesn't know who
he is the head bartender at the Connaught Hotel, a bar which has won, I think, on a number of occasions, the world's best bar. So I followed his work for a bit, and we caught up in person post the COVID pandemic years.
And it's a small world, because I worked, when I was at the Connaught, I worked with Agostino. So then when we first met up and you told me about this project, it just... immediately I thought, well, that's fascinating that you would work with Agostino, and what a small world. But so how did that, what was that collaboration? What did it look like?
So we caught up post-COVID when we could meet in person again, and he was showing me some of the things that he was doing, and immediately I could tell he was a very creative mind. So he was sharing with me his work on Instagram, and there was one project that he showed me that triggered this idea. So he showed me his work that he did with Alan Schaller. So Alan Schaller is this black and white photographer, and Agostino is very much into his photography as well.
He is indeed.
And he was saying how inspired he was by Alan's work. And his work is all around black and white images. So he thought, imagine we could create an experience for people where the cocktail was black and white, and you couldn't tell the flavors in the cocktail until you tried it. It was very monochrome. And when he showed me that, it sparked the idea of, actually, what would an Energize cocktail look like if we were to do something together? And Ago just said to me at the time, Simon, give me a few weeks. Let me go away and think about what that could look like, and I'll share my thoughts with you, and we'll go from there. And I wasn't sure what he was going to come back with, and he came back and said, this is the idea I've got. I got the perfect glass for it because it matches the circle on the cover of your book. And I think we can work to shoot the video for this being made, and maybe we can start serving it to customers. And that's how it came about.
And he's not only a very creative person, but he's also a great craftsman, as in the way he puts his cocktails together beautifully, kind of balanced and well
and it goes back to the experience. I think it's all about experiences. I remember when I took the editing team from Penguin, my publishers, I took them to the bar, and I arrived a bit early so that we could sign the books, because I think the magic of the experience is when the cocktail is served on your table, but on a copy of my book. And so I wanted each of these books to be signed specifically for each of the editors I was bringing in from Penguin. But the experience was made truly enriching by the fact that it was like a 3-course dinner, but through drink. So you would have a dining course experience through drink, and then the pièce de résistance was at the end when the Energize cocktail came out.
Wow. Awesome. Now, on that note of people kind of taking your work and in some way finding a taste way of representing that, everyone who comes on the podcast, I'm quite into, the use of generative AI. And for everyone who comes on the show, I create a conceptualized dish that in some way relates to how at least I've interpreted their work, and or their character, or all of this kind of goes into it. And what I have for you here, Simon, is my interpretation of your work in a dish form. Now, what we've got here... You're making me hungry now. Yeah, well, there we go. So what we've got here is I wanted a dish that had a certain element of peace and calm and presence and togetherness, which I think is kind of reflected through the color tones and the composition of what you have here in the dish. I also wanted there to be a element of energy and dynamism, and that's captured in the kind of sculptural piece that you have there in the dish, because I kind of felt that there needed to be a kind of element of motion or movement or energy that was reflected in it in certain ways. So that's my manifestation of this. Well, I mean, I've read your book, as I said, I read the book about a year or more ago. It was before we'd actually
Yeah.
met. And then I kind of constantly kind of gone back, because it's a great book to kind of go back and dip into, and you know, you can also kind of read parts of it. And this is what I've taken away.
Thank you so much, Joseph.
So-
I like it.
We have our, and as I said, by the time this is out, probably our dinners will have already started. But for those who have maybe missed out on the first round of dinners, if they want to learn more about the amazing world of energy and energy management, aside from obviously picking up your book,
Yeah.
how can people find out more?
Sure. So if you're listening and you want to find out more, do check me out on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Instagram. My handle is @SimonAlexanderO.
And you travel all over the world doing this as well, don't you? We
Yeah,
were just talking
I think
about
that's one of
this.
the benefits of my work is I get invited to speak at lots of different conferences and events. So I just came back from doing Dubai and Ireland. I'm going to be in Singapore next, and the US later in the year. And so it's just great to share my work with different audiences and to understand different cultures as well, because I also get to learn from the people I meet and the events I get to experience.
Wonderful. Simon, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I'm feeling energized. This is one of those good, energizing conversations. So thank you
Absolutely.
very much for supercharging my day.
Thank you so much for having me, Joseph.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.